is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And what you just set up, Tim, they had that. They had the autonomy. They knew what they were doing. And if they didn't, I bet they would take a teammate along, and they had a purpose, do a good job, or get this, whatever they were doing, widget done.
And I think this is sort of the point of the book is maybe assume the best, right? No, when you're in doubt, assume the best about people. Go through your day, thinking about these issues that we've been discussing, and maybe not being quite so scared, and being willing to take a little more chance to trust your fellow man and know that they're not inherently out to get you.
Right.
And each one of us who makes that decision and thinks that way and lives our life that way has a profound impact on everyone in the world. I really do think each of us is a point of light in the world, and we all have to do our part. Hey everybody, it is Tim, and if you see me out and about, I hope you'll call me Beast, and I'm here with Dr. Mary White. Mary, how are you?
Always good, and always good to talk to you.
Thank you. So we have a very interesting conversation. Right now we're going to talk about the book Humankind by Rutger Bregman, and I read this book and found it really interesting. It's very, the premise is sort of that we are sort of taught, and we all seem to believe that humans are inherently evil and flawed. And Mr. Bregman sort of took it upon himself to say, well, is this true? And let's research some of that, and let's see what premise we come to at the end. And as you might guess, he sort of thinks that that's not necessarily the case. So the beginning of the book, he starts out talking about this. We sort of have this in our culture, in our religion. There's sort of premise that man is flawed and basically inherently a sinner and can't be trusted and sort of inherently evil. And if you're in a bad situation, that humans will typically just sort of default to something terrible. So I wanted to start with you and see, like, for that very basic premise, where do you come in on that?
Well, I don't come in it at all. I can tell you probably where some of it started was from the Adam and Eve story, totally, flawed human beings. They had this chance at paradise and ruined it by, eating the apple or whatever. I mean, that,
right. And this condemns us all for all time. Right?
Because it's not only repeated in biblical stories, but it's also probably Greek mythology, probably Roman mythology, Norse mythology. This kind of, man has to redeem himself by doing good. That kind of, to me, perpetuated the hero myth when you think about it.
Interesting.
And I don't necessarily believe that humans are not necessarily kind or evil. And I really subscribe, Tim. It's often misquoted, and this is not the right quote, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but Anne Frank saying that she really believes people are good at heart. Right. And, I'm very attracted to that line. I have been for a long time. It's misquoted often to mean something else, but I really truly believe that. And here she is, dying of typhus at a concentration camp.
Well, it's an interesting premise for the book, and I found it very interesting. And he spends many, many pages looking at it from every possible angle. And I have a lot of notes about this.
Really?
But one of the first things he talks about is that there are these very core, important stories and scientific studies that we've all heard about that seem to prove this point, right?
Sure.
The first thing that comes to mind is probably the Lord of the Flies, right?
Sure. I have another one that comes to mind.
Okay. Well, so what's the one that comes to your mind first?
Brown eyes, blue eyes.
Tell me about that one.
It was a very famous study. I'm not sure it's the 50s or 60s. Of course, it would be completely not capable of doing, but I think it was in New York. A teacher in New York basically said anybody with brown eyes is, not going to go to the playground today, and what the study concluded was that they, the blue-eyed kids started treating them poorly. And so I think that corroborates that a little bit. I don't know the outcome of the study, but I'm sure it would never be able to be done today. Thank goodness.
Well, right. And this is one of the ones in the book that he talks about. And it's very interesting because he'll take these famous studies and things that have gone down. And he basically takes each one and shows you the flaw,
So,
why something was wrong about it.
so he did do that study, Brown.
Yes,
Oh,
that is definitely one that was in the book that I remember. And that gets into something we're going to talk about a little bit later about the expectations of the educator and the way they treat the students, how the students respond to that. And that's basically what you just described, right?
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
then there's a whole lot of conversation in this book about how humans are sort of wired to try to help each other, but also to trust people more like themselves. And so when you divide the students into the brown eyes or the blue eyes, then you have this inherent bias. And this is sort of part of our DNA and our wiring that's really interesting. And this sort of premise that I just described runs all throughout the book. But before we get into that too deeply, let's talk about some of these other studies as well. Lord of the Flies, he mentions, it's a very famous story.
Yeah.
The young boys on the island, and then they just sort of tear each other apart, and it's just chaos. So he actually found an actual event where a group of young boys sailed off on a ship to try to escape, ended up on a desert island, and what happened. And just as an example, and in the actual story, they actually got along famously. They set up cooperative society. They didn't tear each other apart or run into teams.
Cool.
But they all decided to help each other and get along. And so he uses that as one example of how that story, which is a fiction novel, is so embedded into us. And we think, well, that's how kids are going to be.
Let me give you this slogan, dog eat dog. I mean, we are wired for that, I think. I don't know if he talks about some of the language that's used too, like,
But my point is, but this is like a cultural premise that we're all grow up with. And then you add the whole religious thing where religion basically tells us that we're all sinners and we have to redeem ourselves. And we're sort of set up to believe this.
Right. And what intrigued you about that, by the way? You were like, no.
Well, I have to tell you, because the last 10 years have really challenged my struggle to feel good about my fellow man, if I'm perfectly honest. And I felt like I wanted to feel better about the people around me. And this book did make me feel better about it, because by the end, you think, he sort of proves his point that we're not necessarily like this, and that there's so many positive things of how we actually interact. But let's go back to the studies, because I do want to get into that in a minute. There's another famous one. I don't know if you've heard of this, about Stanford University. They did this prison thing down in the basement, right? And they divided the students. Some of them were the guards and some of them were the inmates, and how the story that came from this supposed experiment. Do you remember it?
No.
Anyway, it turned out that the premise that this scientist was made famous for, psychologist, was that the inmates treated the prisoners, no, the guards treated the inmates with huge cruelty, right? And basically got power hungry and started abusing them and treating them. And the inmates became despondent and practically suicidal. And the whole thing was laid out and was very famous. And again, everybody pointed to it and said, well, you see, the guards are always terrible and the inmates are, and of course he takes it apart and goes back and studies it and discovered that this was all sort of a setup, right? And that actually they were, yes, the man that wanted the study to prove this point so badly that he sort of set it up and coerced them into, like, the inmates wanted to quit and he wouldn't let them. And then the guards didn't want to be mean. And so he sort of convinced them or coerced them. So it's really, that part's disconcerting, that the scientist or the psychologist, like he's sort of, but and now he's famous, right? And a lot of this happens over and over in these studies, Mary, is that he will take them each one and show how actually it didn't prove but we all still believe it. It's because it's so famous.
About these studies, were they all done like 1950s or before, or 1960s?
Yes, 50s, 60s, 70s, mostly that kind of thing, or when most of them came from.
Well,
Tim, there's another one. Remember the famous one where they shock each other?
Yeah,
this is really famous. Like, they're hooked up to a machine and You remember
They
it?
yeah, and they can give each other varying degrees or increased shockingness, if you will. That's not a word, but increased pain via the shock. And some people, they said, some kid, I thought it was with kids, but probably not. We're getting some, I don't know, pleasure out of giving other people pain.
Right. And this is what supposedly we learned from this, that went down into the annals of our culture, that people are actually just, brutal, and that they'll really hurt somebody. Well, as you might guess, he took that apart, went back and studied it, looked at the actual notes. It was a setup too. Now, what was interesting about this to me was that the premise that he came away from was that people they often wanted to stop. And he kept trying to coerce them. Come on, you have to give them more. But what was interesting was his deduction was that they thought they were helping, because the premise of the whole thing was you are here at a scientist's experiment, and this is going to help us help people. So I want you to follow through on this experiment, because this is really going to do good for people later.
Right.
So the people that were hesitant, he kept reminding them, oh, this is for science. And if you will follow through, this will really give us the research that we need. And so people actually thought they were helping by continuing to be cruel.
Yeah, it's crazy. What I was saying, Tim, was like this all. So now the International Review Board, the IRB, would never allow any of these.
Oh, of course. Go
on. I mean, I like an IRB process, for just because I have a PhD, an IRB process is very involved now, and you cannot do human against human experiments, really.
Right.
You have to go through a lot.
By the way, if I'm remembering reading this correctly, nobody was actually getting shocked anyway, Mary. It was all a setup. There's some guy in the next room just pretending to scream. The study was on the people that were pushing the buttons, and they hear the guy screaming in the next room, but there wasn't actually anybody. So it's all like a setup to try to make some sort of point. But what's frustrating what?
They could have been like not doing it to set it up to experiment on the person with the buzzer.
That's who we're studying, is the person with the buzzer, right? So there actually, if I remember it, there wasn't actually anybody being buzzed, but the interesting thing was how far people would go if they knew that it was really, really dangerous. But it was all a setup. So this is sort of his premise is, look, what's frustrating to him and to me as a reader is that all of these really famous studies have gone down in history to prove this point, that we're actually inherently brutal and cruel, when none of them actually proved that at all. But now that it's out there in the culture, we just assume that's the way it is.
It's definitely a storied part of the culture, Tim, for sure. I mean, my mother taught me that brown eye, blue eye one, like from when I was young. I mean, so it's definitely been throughout history, for sure.
And that was one of his points. And that made, it's sort of like, it's helpful to see that big arc of sort of misinformation that is still inherent. So his point was, well, let's pull back the curtain and show you how this isn't necessarily the case. Now, one of the things that's interesting, I mentioned to you that people actually wanted to be helpers. One of his things, he talks about from the very earliest civilization, like when we're just in these packs of Neanderthals, primitive people. Like he talked about how cooperative they were. Like the sociologists who have studied all that, everybody basically got along famously. They would be in these groups of not too many people. And then when they interacted with other groups, it wasn't crazy warfare like in 2001, like we imagine, right? It was actually, they all kind of got together and they would help each other and maybe trade off some members and then go on their way. And because they were nomadic and always sort of on this process of moving and meeting other groups, it wasn't constant warfare back in the times.
Boy, that sure gives you some sort of heartwarm, doesn't it? Like
absolutely
a little hope.
And the other thing that's interesting too is he talks about how we and animals evolved to be social and also to be cuddly looking. and to be friendly. Basically, he felt like the animals that did the best over time were the ones who evolved to be friendly and friendly looking. And this is inherent in our interactions with each other as well. So like dogs evolved, say, from a wolf. And his point was they actually changed their physiology to be more cuddly, more like a plush animal that we see today, right? And they are also the ones that survived, the survival of the fittest. The ones that survived the best were the ones that got along and were actually friendly.
Wow.
So that's not the way we hear it, right? We hear that whoever was the strongest and was going to have the most power. This is not the way it actually happened.
Oh my gosh, my mind is blown.
Isn't it interesting?
Right.
And the other thing he points out, by the way, is that humans are the only species that can blush. We're the only ones that blush.
And why did he point that out? Like what, that just because
it's part of our inherent friendliness and cooperative nature. And the reason that we blush is usually because of shame. So we are inherently show that we are embarrassed or upset, and because of this nature he describes of sort of friendliness and cooperation. Now, what happened, Mary, was we started getting civilized, and that was our big downfall. Because as soon as someone put up some gates and said, "This land is mine," the problem started. Because all of a sudden you had to protect it and you had to fight everybody off, right? And then also everybody got stuck together in all these towns because now they're all starting to fight each other over these supposed new little land like we broke it all up, right? And then of course, then that brings famine and plague because we're all stuck together. So this sort of shift from the nomadic small little tribes to this civilization was really the beginning of the downfall of our cooperative nature.
Wow.
Isn't that interesting?
So interesting, Tim. I love thinking about this kind of stuff. And BTW, I think you are kind of cute, so you would definitely survive.
Well, I think it's very interesting. So then I'm sort of trying to give you a broad overview of these main topics that he talks about. So I'm sorry I'm sort of jumping around a little bit, but I thought it was so interesting. But again, the author of the book Humankind, Rutger Bregman, sort of his premise is, well, let's talk about all these things that we think are inherent in humans and see if that's really true. Now, he talks about power and how power tends to corrupt. He says here, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, we've heard this. And this gets into the interesting part about workers and managers and bosses. Yeah. Okay, I'm saving the children in school part for later because I know you're going to love that. But you were a boss, right?
Right.
You were a boss, you were a manager. So we believe as a society, right, that people are basically unmotivated and lazy, and bosses have to be there.
And this came from the Taylor scientific studies, right? Where like bosses were the people, they had to be there and put their thumb on these people who were lazy and didn't want to work, as well as Henry Ford and all these kind of things, which is scientific management. I'm sorry, I was losing. It came from management, and Taylor did those studies. Am I right?
So what's interesting to me about this is, and he points this out, that we each tend to believe that we are actually motivated workers, but we also tend to believe that everybody else isn't. Wow. Like most people think, I'm a hard worker, I'm motivated, but most of my coworkers aren't motivated. This is what we tend to assume about each other.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, just in my own experience, because I felt like I was always motivated to work and do well and work hard. And I knew lots of people who were there with me.
Well, that's good. But I think like average guy on the street who works in a factory or at a job in a store or something tends to think they're the exception. But what's interesting is we can't all think that we're the exception, right? Because then we're not all the exception.
Right.
He also tends to think everybody just cares about themselves. And I think these are like premises that people use to pit us against each other and to coerce us.
Well, I think they used it too, to create structures. it, like the 8-hour workday or the agricultural calendar in school, or, things, structures that really did do that.
Right. But somebody's benefiting by having us all believe this stuff. Well, the factory would never work if there wasn't somebody who had to be in charge watching us all the time. Listen, I have a friend who is a high-powered, very successful lawyer who brings in millions of dollars for his company. And do you know that his boss takes account of his time on his computer? And I'm like, monitors his computer activity and the amount of time he's in the office. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. But it plays back to this idea that people
unprofessional. Right. But it plays back into that idea that obviously he's not working.
So he tells the story of a business, of a man who decided to do this differently. And what he did was he bought a company that had all these workers, and they had all these managers keeping track of everybody and thumb on them and checking their time clocks and how much time. I have a friend that worked for one of the delivery services, and they would actually time his bathroom breaks. I mean, I'm like, really, this happens, people, in the real world. So this man said, I'm not going to do this. So you know what he did, Mary? He fired every manager, and he had no management. And he said, okay, you people over here that are working on this project, go. Do your thing.
Figure it out.
Do it however you want to do it. I don't care. You just get it. You make it work. Right? And so do you think that worked?
Yes.
Well, of course it did, the way I set it up. But
right.
Somebody else would think, oh, no, someone has to watch them and make sure and guide them and make sure they don't go askew. And are they going to use the money the right way? But what happened in this, at least in this instance, maybe not perfectly, but really, really well, was each team suddenly had all this autonomy. And they were like, well, how would I want to use my time? How are we going to use our budget? How are we going to set this up to accomplish our goal? And it worked famously. They were happier. They got it done. They had autonomy. They felt like they had agency in their work and suddenly the business skyrockets.
Now, Daniel Pink says 3 things in his book, Drive. He says autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And what you just set up, Tim, they had that. They had the autonomy. They knew what they were doing. And if they didn't, I bet they would take a teammate along, and they had a purpose, do a good job, or get this, whatever they were doing, widget done. So and that's in the book Drive by Daniel Pink, who I love. Like, he's like a boyfriend of mine for sure.
He's pretty great.
I love him. And so it's worth a read too, Tim.
But what's interesting, Mary, is that we tend to think, as our culture has bought into this idea, that we can't sort of do it on our own without someone holding a gun to our head, And I've never done good in situations where somebody was staring over me or pressuring me. I don't work well that way.
I don't either. And I hopefully was never a boss like that,
Oh, I'm sure not. By the way, his quote of this business manager was, simply believing in something can make it come true.
Do you know what the business was, Tim? Just, I'm interested, because
I would have to go back to the book, and I do not remember. He describes it, but it was something where a group of people had some sort of project they had to accomplish, but then nobody was going to tell them how to do it. He uses another example of democracy using this, where in Venezuela, I'm just going to tell this story briefly. A mayor was elected, and his whole premise of his campaign was, I'm going to let the people decide what we spend our money on, what we do, how this is all going to work. And everybody's like, nobody can do that. Someone up in management in the government must be able to tell you, well, this is what. So anyway, he did this, and he got hired. He got elected as the mayor, and then he said, okay, everybody, you tell me, where do you want to spend the money? What projects are most important for our community? And what happened was the citizens suddenly rose up and got excited and got involved, and they all started working together. And we're talking about high-powered, expensive, high-rich people and lowly worker people, and they all got together and they made decisions. Oh, we want more money for schools, and we want more money for roads, and they decided. And you know what? Like, of course, it worked out famously. Like, Everybody got involved and worked together. It wasn't what we've been told, that everybody was going to be fighting and dog eat dog the whole time. But no,
Right. Not happening. It's not the Venezuela of today, but okay.
this
That's,
was a city in Venezuela at some
yeah.
point where this happened. It's obviously very difficult for this to happen because there's so much
Yeah.
embedded
Yes.
infrastructure. What's the right
Right.
word?
Bureaucracy.
Yes, right. It's all there. And all these managers, people don't want to give up their power, because we talked about power making people do bad things, right? And this is true. We see it around us all the time. But the point is, if someone can be in charge and not have the need for their own ego or
Right.
power, and can say, let's all do this together, his premise is everybody does it. Everybody rises to the occasion, and suddenly they have agency and motivation and some power to make a difference. And it worked out famously.
Yeah. So people, you're saying cream really rises to the top. People will rise to the occasion, which is
This is his premise. And this is another of the examples in this book that we're discussing where he showed how that could happen in the right circumstances, with the right people in charge, with the right motivations and lack of ego, etc. Now I want to read this quote because he talked about this story I just described to you, where there was involvement from every level of society in the government, and they did make all the choices that you and I would want them to make.
right.
Like they did, because it wasn't some guy watching out for his friend or his job, right?
Or being paid under the table.
None of that, right? So, hey, by the way, thanks, Kristen, for watching, and for commenting. Anyway, here's one of the quotes from the book. He said, this example I just gave went from cynicism to engagement, from polarization to trust, from exclusion to inclusion, from complacency to citizenship, from
I love it.
corruption to transparency, from self-interest to solidarity, and from inequality to dignity. All of these things happened because these people were given the chance to make the decisions and have a real say in their government.
And don't we want all those things on the right side of that continuum? I do.
Absolutely. So this is what was inspiring to me about the book, right? Was that, like, it's not, I don't see it happening around me, but I don't want to have the premise that people are inherently are stupid or evil or cruel,
Right.
that they basically want to help. Okay, I got a few more examples. Are you up for all this?
I
Let me
mean,
jump
this
back
is
to the.
fascinating for me, Tim. You know I eat this stuff up.
Okay, so
You told me not to read the book, but I think, that may be something to do.
well, I enjoyed it. It was kind of scholarly at times,
Well,
but
that's
that didn't put me off
power.
because it was okay. So let's talk about the children in school. You already mentioned the brown eyes and the blue eyes, and he talks about how it's been clearly shown that children will perform better when they're expected to by their teachers. There's this famous, I don't know if you've heard this famous thing of the young teacher that was given her class, and she thought that they all had these ridiculously high IQ numbers.
Right.
It turned out it was their locker numbers.
Right.
But what happened was she thought, my whole class is really, really smart. They gave me all the good kids. And what happened? They all rose to her expectation and did famously because she expected of them just by default.
I think it's a beautiful story. And yes, I've heard of that. I didn't remember that it was their locker accommodations or anything.
Well,
like
that's one of the stories that I heard. But I mean, this happens a lot, right? But the point is, if somebody tells you, oh, Johnny was a real problem last year, man, he never
Yeah.
really finished. Well, then here, suddenly there he is in your class, and you're going to go like, oh man, I'm not going to expect much of Johnny. Well, that's not very helpful to Johnny.
No, not at all.
So how do you counter that as an administrator?
I think you just set things up with culture. I mean, you yourself are a model for that kind of culture. You're not talking about people. You're not telling people bad stuff. It's all kind of growth mindset stuff. You're really setting the stage for, let's see the good and not the bad. Johnny has a real problem. He has ADHD or whatever he has, but he can recite every baseball player from 1963 to 19 whatever. So then already they're set up for, oh boy, Johnny's a really good, you know what I mean? So I think it's like that, like you're constantly modeling that and also highlighting and showcasing people that are doing the same thing.
it's important. So I like this idea, and I knew you would appreciate this part because um, I feel like our inherent expectations of people in every situation that we find ourselves in is just wildly, wildly influential in how things
Yeah.
go and how we enjoy it and how we react.
Tim, isn't it true? Like, you know, I haven't seen the movie Superman. Have you? Have you seen the movie Superman?
Oh, I did.
Okay. And I know you're a fan of Superman, period, right? And did you love it?
I had a hard time with the movie because I found it very dark and unfortunately overly relevant to my world around me. But I loved the premise. I loved how they set him up and who he was in the midst of all that.
But a lot of bad press, I felt like a lot of bad things were getting going around about the premise. So I think people were going into the movie. This is just a very oversimplified example of that. You know, going into the movie already with a mindset that this is whatever.
Well,
And
and this is obviously one of my points for this conversation is look, everybody, we live in a time right now where everybody is looking to be outraged and they're looking to divide and think badly of each other. And one of the premises of this book that I really wanted to get from it was that, hey, we need to stop and we need to question some of that because people around us are working from maybe bad premises, but that doesn't mean we're actually all bad.
right.
And they
Yeah.
might be getting a bunch of bad information and living in their little bubble of bad information, but that doesn't make them a bad person. And we're going to get to that a little later in this conversation about how you deal with those thoughts about those people that you don't understand. But while we're talking about school, he also talked about how concerning it is to so many people that children have so little free time for play.
Oh, yes. I just was talking about this to someone the other day. It wasn't about free play, it was about the cafeteria. Like, I wasn't in the cafeteria all the time, but I would walk through, like, pretty much, a few times during the lunch periods that started at 10:30, by the way, and ended at 1 o'clock when we had 750 children in a school. So I would go and they would be quiet. And I'm like, why are these kids quiet? Well, they were too loud. I don't care. I
Right.
get allowed. If you
Yeah.
put that many adults, if you put 150 adults in a cafeteria, you would only be able to hear the people close to you. That's what you're supposed to do. These kids do not have a chance to talk. Let them talk.
Well, and like you think about kids today, back when I was a kid, and I hate to start like that, but I mean, like I had a lot of time to just get on my bike with my friends and go ride and do things and have
Yeah.
fun. But now, like a lot of kids' time is totally measured out. We're going to ballet and then we go to softball and then we have 10 minutes for this activity and then we have to do our homework. And their whole day is structured. And when do they get to just play?
Right. Yeah. And there's rules in Florida. Both Tim and I live in Florida, about 20 minutes of uninterrupted recess. But I mean, schools find a way around that, you know. And so I'm
I
just
mean,
saying,
they don't even give the kids the 20 minutes?
well, it's 20 minutes of uninterrupted play time and then 150 minutes of physical movement per week. That's what the legislation says. I mean, 2 years ago when I left, that's what it said. 20 minutes of unstructured a day and 150 minutes of physical playtime a week.
Well, I mean, I've had times in my own life, Mary, where I felt like I was overly structured and I was so busy and I didn't have time for something that I thought was fun for me or not structured. And I have since discovered that that was really bad for me. So
Yeah,
imagine it for a child, right? When they just don't have time to just use their imagination and run around and have fun and do whatever they might want to do. And I do think that's a concern for today's children.
yeah, but you know what? When kids can't read, it's even a bigger concern for that principal. So there's a lot at play there. It's much more gray than black and white, Tim.
And
You
what I'm really talking about, Mary, is like not during school time. I'm
Oh,
talking about
okay.
after school time when they get picked up and they have the rest of their day, and that's completely structured. That's what I really was referring to.
Okay. Well, I still would like them to have playtime in school.
Of course.
I was
Of
never
course.
so the little kindergarten wooden kitchens come back into the classrooms. Like that makes me happy, like in kindergarten to see the kitchens and the puppets. That's what kids need to be doing. And they came back, by the way. which especially now, Tim, I feel like people spend a lot of screen time. I'm not talking computer or iPad, television. I mean, it's right in our face all the time. To learn to have conversation and learn to play with someone is a skill now.
Yeah.
We need to learn it as a skill.
Yeah,
But
that's what playgrounds were for. Yeah, by
yeah.
the way, he talks about that kids thrive on playgrounds made out of junkyards.
Oh, wouldn't
Like
that be?
we would all like, oh no, they're going to hurt themselves and they're going to cut their hands off and all this stuff, but that never happens. And like kids can thrive in like an abandoned war zone area. Like his sort of premise is kids are inherently okay and know how to help deal with themselves, even in what we would tend to think of as a dangerous situation. They're having fun and they're having play, and they actually don't all end up dead.
Right. It would never fly. I mean, really, honestly, it wouldn't fly, but it just, you're saying it, that kids are using play to learn how to be an adult. And if they don't have this play and this, imagination working, it's not going to work.
And
And
he actually tells the story of this playground made out of junkyard with
I,
all the dangerous stuff sitting around and how the kids were all okay.
yes,
But
but the insurance adjuster would disagree with
I
you.
understand all those pieces. But his point is our premise of kids being cruel and stupid and not being able to take care of themselves. That's sort of what his premise is during this part. He also talked about a special school in a special European country where the students were able to choose their own curriculum.
Oh, I would love that. You know it.
And there weren't all the desks and the regulars, but everybody
Right.
was like, what do you want to study? And then, of course, they had the right type of staff and environment to support that. But the students actually didn't sit around and waste their time, but they actually were intrinsically motivated to go and learn things that they were excited about.
Yeah, I want to learn how a steam engine works. Let me just build
Right,
one.
right.
Yeah.
But again, that's not the way schools are typically set up for a lot of reasons, and we're not going to go too far down all those rabbit holes.
Down there.
Okay, so let's get back to, let me try to wrap this back around to the premise we're talking about, everybody, is this book of Humankind by Rutger Bregman. Is that right?
Can you show the
Rutger Bregman, sorry. Humankind. And his premise is that we're actually not inherently evil, out to get each other and conniving, but we're actually sort of wired from the earliest days of humans arriving on the planet of sort of cooperation and friendliness. And then, of course, that got really challenged when we all started being civilized and dividing the world up into little pieces. And then we had to fight each other to keep our good, when before it was all cooperative. So that was sort of the premise. We've already talked about it a little bit. Here's a few more things that he talks about that I think are important. And then we're going to get to the wrapping this up a little bit and having a different kind of discussion. He talks about mirrored behavior, right? This is one of the things that is maybe an answer, right? I will treat you the way that you treat me.
Yeah.
So he gives plenty of examples in this book of situations where that worked. One of them being a prison.
Wow.
Because in prisons, typically the guards are taught to be cruel. You can't trust a thing that the inmates will do. You have to keep them behind bars, very carefully monitored. And it's cruel and inhuman. And as you might guess, the inmates tend to act like they are not trustworthy because they're being treated that way. And we're talking again, the way that your expectation of how someone is going to treat you, you might bring it to pass. So he talks about a prison where they actually didn't have guns. They weren't in cells. They all sort of got along together. The inmates had the autonomy to cook their meals and grow their crops and gardens. And it just is one example of a way to have incarcerated people be treated like humans, and they rise to the occasion. And the guard isn't inherently want to beat somebody up, but they actually can sort of be friendly. They're all in this environment together where they're having to spend this time. So it's sort of, again, this mirrored behavior, how I think about you and how I treat you and how I'm going to want you to treat me. This is very significant. People treat us like we are like how we're going to treat them.
Sure. Is that the golden rule, Tim?
That is the golden rule.
Okay. I
That
like
is the golden rule, but we don't believe it.
we don't.
Does our society act like we believe the golden rule?
Well, structurally, maybe not. Or from the top down, I don't know, maybe not. But I think like in your small circles, don't they act like that?
I think they do. I think amongst my friends and amongst people, but his premise is you have to get to that point. You have to have an inherent trust in your fellow man. And one of the ways to start to get that back, in his opinion, is to let go of this premise that everybody's out to get you and everybody's inherently evil and conniving and untrustworthy, and that most people are actually trying to be helpful and friendly if given the circumstances where they can do that. Now, we've already talked about a whole bunch of reasons why people get trapped into
Right.
not trusting each other, being told that the other is scary and dangerous and out to get you and ruin your way of life. And all that's all just way that people are trying to control us all. The other thing he talks about a lot in the book is that contact is key. Getting to know someone, spend time with them.
Yeah.
The famous Mark Twain quote about travel is it kills.
Oh, I'm trying to think of it too.
Anyway, your biases, right? What's the right word for that? Anyway, you can't. If people are afraid of the other because they haven't had contact and they don't know them, and he mentions in the book, this was very true of say gay people before, like gay people started becoming more open, more out.
Right.
People knew that there were gay couples, and all of a sudden they're not so scary because we're like, oh, well, that gay couple's just fine, and I like them, and they're not scary.
They're really good people,
Right, but you have to know that they're who they are, and then you have to have some contact with them, and not just like passing contact, but actually stop and have a conversation, have some interaction. He talks about neighborhoods that were integrated, blacks and whites and immigrants living together, and once they got to know each other, they would take care of each other, and those biases, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Prejudices fly out the window. There were times when there were like race riots back in the day, and men would come into these neighborhoods trying to find the black people and harm them. And when you had a neighborhood where the whites and the blacks were friends and neighbors and knew each other and had real meaningful contact, they would assist each other. They would help to hide the people that they were there to harm, and they would not participate because they had the contact. And this is what's one of my concerns about our world today, is we're dividing ourselves into these little clans, and we're being told to be afraid of the other. But when you actually travel and get to know people that aren't like you, and get to go to places where people are completely different from you, then you realize, oh, well, these people are okay and they're nice. And why did the people tell me to be scared about them, right?
Right. And they put their pants on one leg at a time, just like you do. And
yeah, he talks about, like, for example, even another example would be, he mentions in the military, there would be groups of them. I can't think of these terms right off the top of my head, everybody. Sorry. But, like a whole
platoon.
A what? Platoon, sure. But if they had all the different races and nationalities and everybody mixed together, that even though somebody may have gone in being very prejudiced against, say, black people,
Yes.
as soon as they spent time with those other soldiers and found respect for them and got to know them, those prejudices very clearly went away. And it just proves the point that it's the contact.
Right.
And spending time with those not like yourselves. And I do really worry about people that live in a small town and never leave it and don't ever get to know anybody that's not exactly like them. And they're being told everywhere that everybody else is dangerous and scary and we have to stop them, whatever. And but if I have immigrants in my neighborhood or people that aren't like me and I get to know them and I realize who they are, those biases and prejudices fly away.
And most people are like that, Tim. Most people, you're just hearing about the people that are not.
So his point, of course, is we need to do all these things. We need to meet other people and get outside of our bubbles, and we need to start questioning these inherent biases that we've been told from religion and society
Right.
and culture for all these years about this. Because his premise at the end of the book, his sort of basic premise is, look, most people really want to work cooperatively and help each other out. And sometimes that can end up looking like something bad because they think I'm in this group and they're telling me if I fight those people, that's helping. So sometimes people end up doing things that are not good, but their motivation is inherently this human quality of cooperation and friendliness. Isn't that interesting?
Very. Yeah, it's very interesting, Tim.
And here's the challenge, right? Because yes, we can break down those biases and prejudices by contact and getting to know people and spending time, but there's also this inherent thing where we're drawn to people more like ourselves. And he proves this. He says we just are inherently drawn to and want to spend time and trust people more when they're like me, right? When it's familiar. So this is like another piece of in the DNA of the way we're built that we just need to be aware of so that we can sort of challenge that and go like, okay, I know that like these people that are just like me, I feel more comfortable, but I need to be aware of that sort of inherent human bias. And that I think that was something that we evolved back in the day when we were hunter-gatherers in little clans, right? Because it helped us to survive. But now that we're in the middle of civilization and we're being pitted against each other, we need to stop and think about this.
So Harvard University does an entire class that you can take for free. It's not a class. It's like an assessment, if you will, to find out what your implicit biases are. And we all have them. I mean, it's certainly human not to have, we all have them. So it's very interesting to do this. I would just, if you were interested, to Google, Harvard University implicit bias, and you're going to get links to that where you can, and some of the assessments are quite lengthy. So it does take some time, but it really gets to the root and the heart of the matter.
I found it just really interesting that his premise was to try to prove that we aren't inherently out for ourselves and out to get the other guy, but that we're actually inherently built to be friendly and cooperative. But we have to be aware that we also have this inherent bias to be more comfortable and, tend to want to help those that are more like us. So I don't think that's all bad. It's just something to be aware of and to know.
Yes, that's what I think. I don't think it's bad. I think it's, you could have a conversation, a self-talk about it. Like, wait a second, do I not want to talk to that person because they're this, or that? And then and maybe move in, I don't know. I don't think it's all bad. I think it's just human.
Yeah, but I think that his point is let's understand how we're sort of wired and let's understand how we ended up this way. And then let's do better, right? And I read this book because I inherently wanted to feel better about my fellow man. And I didn't want to think that everybody was stupid or fearful or ignorant or, and I did come away from reading the book feeling like, yes, we are actually not inherently evil and flawed. And yes, we can actually get along. And it gave me hope again, even though it pointed out so many examples of times when things didn't go well and why. But he kept going back to his premise that we can each make a difference. So he ends the book by giving us 10 rules, his 10 rules to live by.
I love a rule, Tim.
So 10 rules to live by. These are just at the end of the book. He's like, okay, so here's what I think are the 10 things that I use in my life to try to do better and counter all of these things that we've just discussed over these hundreds.
Are you going to write these down for me at some point? Or
I'll be happy to. I have it right here on a document I can share with you. These are in his language, and I'm just sort of paraphrasing. Of course, he explains each one in depth. But his first one was, when in doubt, assume the best.
Assume positive intentions. We say this all the time.
Right, because I think that we walk through the world sometimes assuming the worst, and that doesn't serve us well because then we tend to bring the worst to ourselves.
Presume positive intention.
Right. So if you're not sure about somebody, maybe start with the premise that, well, maybe their intentions are good. Maybe I should assume the best. Number two is, I love this one. This may be my favorite. Think in win-win scenarios.
Yes.
I
Love
know
it.
that this is something you know well.
I love a win-win. Yeah, it's in a lot of leadership. Cotter is someone is a win-win leadership, and so I've done some study on that, and I like it. I
I
like it
think
for it.
Right. And I feel like this is something that I've thought a lot about lately is that anytime that there's something, some sort of conflict or something you need to work out with somebody, whatever, there's a lot of times there's a way for it to be a win-win. I've come up with some win-win-wins lately, and like where everybody wins and somebody else wins too, because it's possible for everybody to feel good about the outcome of something. It might take a little work and creativity.
Yeah. We had just done some with conflict, I told you, with my work, and we examined some studies from 1974, actually, Thomas and Kilman conflict inventory. Very interesting about how you each perceive conflict and how you could work toward that togetherness. So something else good to check out.
Yeah, because if you think, okay, how can everybody come away from this feeling good and getting something that's good for them? And actually, I feel like this used to be the way things worked a lot
Things
more.
yeah,
This was sort of the way I always thought about government when I was a young person,
me too.
and everybody was sort of cooperating, that
Yeah,
they would all compromise because they knew, well, I'm not going to get everything my way. And I didn't mean to start talking politics again, but that is the way it used to be, people, believe it or not, before everybody decided that it was only my way is acceptable and everybody else is evil and horrible. Again, this is one of the reasons I wanted to read this book and I wanted to have this conversation, is because that is not the way the world really works. And
right.
we have to cooperate and compromise and work together. And we all know this out in our regular lives. So why don't we expect that of our
Exactly.
leaders?
Why are we not expecting it in all kinds of places?
From our bosses and
Yeah,
from our coworkers and from our leaders and from our family members, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So try to find a win-win in any situation, right? Okay.
right.
Ask more questions.
Good one. Tim, we got to have this on a list. We got to have it on a list.
All right. Well, I'll put this list on the website, everybody, where this has been living. Ask more questions. This one. So, in other words, if you're not, it's usually there's things I don't know. Well, let me check on this. Why are you asking? What do you need? What is this all about? Let's ask more questions and learn more, and then suddenly your world expands and you find out, oh, that is their motivation. Here's another one. Temper your empathy. Train your compassion. He makes a really interesting point in the book that empathy can have a bad side because sometimes you get so feeling for that other person's problem that you get sort of mired in it. He's like, no, don't have empathy, have more compassion, is one of his points, because
Yep.
compassion is something that doesn't narrow your focus or paralyze you.
I recently read something about let's be more worried about the compassion deficit.
Yeah, well, I think that both are important. I think we need a lot more empathy too. But
Yeah.
his point was compassion is something that we can all. Um, it's not paralyzing. If it's empathy for that one person, but what about compassion for all of those people? Then compassion doesn't lock me in. Is his point.
Right.
Here's another one he wrote: try to understand the other, even if you don't get where they're coming from.
Okay.
Yeah. So somebody has some idea that doesn't make sense to you or even scares you or frightens you or something, but like, well, where are they coming from on that? Because again, there might be a win-win in the middle of that somewhere. Let's do another one. Love your own as others love their own.
Now, I did used to tell that to people a lot. Teachers would be very frustrated with parents. I said, you know what? That's their own. If it was yours, you would love that child just as much.
Right. So just like I might, like if you think of your enemy or someone that's frightening you and you think about, well, you know what? They have a family and their mom still probably loves them and they have kids that they're really worried
Right.
about. Like it reminds you that we're all very similar, even if we have misinformation or scary things that are keeping us separate.
Right. And It's complicated though, Tim. It is. It's just complicated, and there's a lot of layers, and there's a lot of unpeeling.
And we're not trying to solve every problem in the world tonight in this one
Oh,
conversation, but I liked these rules. His next rule to live by on this list: avoid the news.
done. Check.
Yeah, I've gotten where I get one morning email of neutral news stories without any sort of bias. It just, here's what's happening, and I read that and I'm done. I think the news can be very, very dangerous these days because it's ever pervasive and
Yeah.
being presented in a way to keep you watching.
Yeah.
So everybody be aware of that. He says avoid the news. His next one is don't punch Nazis. And his point for that is that if you go punch somebody that is doing something scary or demonstrating in a way that you don't like, that only empowers them and doesn't help anybody. Yeah. It just causes conflict. He talked about how, like, if there was a town where they were having a parade of Nazis, and the whole rest of the town decided to have a parade of love at the same time and compassion, and suddenly this wonderful thing came not out of conflict and fighting, but out of demonstrating something more wonderful.
That's really sweet and really a great way.
There's two more.
Okay.
His ninth rule to live by is come out of the closet. Don't be ashamed to do good. He talks about people who are afraid to sort of show that they're being kind and that they're a good person, that they're doing good things. And you don't want to be that showy person that's doing it just to try to get something for yourself. But he says, don't be afraid to be kind and let people know that you're being kind, and that's your premise. It may not be cool or fashionable in certain circles, but it will really help the world.
Oh, I love that.
And the last one is be realistic. And what he means by that is we're living on a planet where people are deeply inclined to be good to one another. That's what he thinks is the real, true realism of it from the premise of the book. I'll say it one more time. He says, we're living on a planet where people are deeply inclined to be good to one another. And he starts with the before civilized man, when we were walking around as hunter-gatherers, they were inclined. They weren't like we're taught somehow to fighting each other and warring. No, they actually helped each other out because they realized this really is going to help me. I got to find food. I got to get along with this next man shows up. We're not going to fight him. We're going to be friendly. This was the way that humans are wired, is his premise. So he says, be realistic about that. People are actually deeply inclined to be good to one another.
Nice.
And that's what I wanted from the book, right? This was a long book with a lot of information. He makes his point over and over and over in a million different ways. But his premise is, don't just assume that what you've been told in some sort of religious connotation or cultural connotation about how people are inherently horrible and out to get one another. This is not actually the way we're wired. And sometimes, as I've already mentioned, people end up doing things that aren't good because they actually think they're helping somehow, right? They're trying to help their group or their family or whatever. And this makes, I'm telling you, be aware of how people are trying to manipulate you for their own benefit, to control you and everybody around you. So let's remember that person that walks by you, even if you think they're scary or you don't understand them, whatever, that they're inclined, they have a family and they really care for their kids, and they're inclined to do good for you and for others. And that made me feel better, Mary.
I think it's great, Tim. And it sounds like it really did have impact on you, and by us talking about it, it's had impact on me. And for those listening, it's had impact on them. So it's really right. I really believe in that one, like the Dalai Lama says, one pebble in the pond, is going to have the ripple effect.
Yeah, he mentions that very thing, that when he talks about that doing good, you're one good thing. I used to love that commercial. Remember that, where somebody did something really nice for someone and the next person did something nice for the next person, and it had this ripple effect all the way. I really think this works. If you smile at someone and say hello, or are kind to the checkout person at the grocery store, or open a door for someone, I do think this has a ripple effect. And I enjoy going through my life trying to, most of the time, not perfect at it, most of the time trying to be a kind person and put that energy out into the world.
We talk about this all the time. Like even opening the door for someone is just a good way to start. Saying please and thank you. You know, I always said please and thank you are the order of the day. That's what we do around here. And it just, it really impacts culturally, I think. It really does, Tim.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of the point of the book is maybe assume the best, right? No, when you're in doubt, assume the best about people. Go through your day, thinking about these issues that we've been discussing, and maybe not being quite so scared, and being willing to take a little more chance to trust your fellow man and know that they're not inherently out to get you.
Right.
And each one of us who makes that decision and thinks that way and lives our life that way has a profound impact on everyone in the world. I really do think each of us is a point of light in the world, and we all have to do our part.
I love it, Tim.
I feel like I did a whole lot of talking tonight because I was sort of
for sure.
Well, I was sort of explaining this, what I came away from the book with, and I've sort of just barely scratched the surface, everyone. But again, the book I read was Humankind by Rutger Bregman. I found it was really interesting, a little bit scholarly at times, but it did make me feel better.
Can you show the packaging, Tim? Can you show the front of the book or no?
I will put that on the video when I edit it. I found it, it did what I wanted it to do. I needed a little boost of how I was feeling about my fellow man. I feel like a little beat up about that the last, say, 8 or 10 years. And this made me feel better about that right now. And I like to think of people as inherently wanting to be, what did he say? They're deeply inclined to be good to one another. That's how I want to feel about my fellow man.
And I am all for it.
Mary, this was fun. Thank you for talking to me.
You got it.
Thanks everybody for watching too.